All right, friends, this is disturbing. Being actively encouraged by other Republican governors and Republican elected officials across the country, the Republican governor of Texas is defying President Biden in the spirit of a recent Supreme Court ruling by ordering Texas troops to erect physical barriers at the federally controlled southern border, leading to a potential escalation in not just legal challenges, but perhaps a literal physical standoff between the state of Texas and the United States government. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert buttons before you go. I greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we have a couple of clips to look at, but this is serious. It's so serious, in fact, that it kept me up last night. I was wide awake at the potential implications of what's going on here. And I promised you 2 videos about the border. This is the first one because these things run in parallel. So first things first, for context. We live in a federal system, so states are sovereign, but they also, in various respects, operate under the purview of the federal government. It's a notion called federal supremacy, right? In certain areas, the federal government is simply supreme, and one of them is with respect to immigration and maintaining external borders. So when it comes to the U.S.-Mexico border, no matter where it crosses, Texas, California, wherever, the federal government is supreme. So there's been tension between Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and President Biden because Abbott ordered Texas troops to erect razor wire and physical barriers at the southern border. And it was preventing the federally controlled Border Patrol to access at areas of the border, right? So there was tension between state and federal government. And the federal government would go in and cut the razor wire if they needed to save migrants who were drowning and then arrest them. Like some people who are despicable are saying, just let them drown. Well, they were rescued, as well they should. And then they were also arrested, okay, because they, of course, crossed the border illegally. But the bottom line is that there was tension between state and federal government. It was legally challenged. It made its way to the United States Supreme Court. And even this regressively conservative Supreme Court told Greg Abbott, you can't keep the federal government from accessing the border. Now, I will say just before we move on, as Wahaja Ali points out, the fact that 4 conservative Supreme Court justices sided with Texas should horrify you. Right-wing money has thoroughly corrupted the court, and another reason why elections matter. It is disturbing that 4 conservative Supreme Court justices felt that Greg Abbott and Texas were somehow on an even or perhaps superior footing than the federal government with respect to the federal border. That aside, what happened was Texas didn't stop putting up the barriers. They didn't stop putting up the razor wire. Texas National Guard soldiers are setting up more razor wire here in Eagle Pass to repel the illegal crossings. Yesterday, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, allowed the Biden administration to remove the wire, but Texas is still blocking Border Patrol from processing migrants in the area. Again, very disturbing. You might think to yourself, well, listen, sometimes orders get lost in the chain of command. Perhaps Abbott, didn't think to issue the order. Perhaps there was a miscommunication. Not at all. So Governor Greg Abbott of Texas issued a statement, basically one of defiance. He says, listen, President Biden has refused to enforce border laws and has even violated them. He doesn't list what laws or cite any evidence of the violations. The result is that he smashed records for illegal immigration. And because President Biden, in Abbott's estimation, is a lawless president, he says James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats. Okay, now again, that's not true. We've talked about this in previous videos. Funding, manpower, resources, and most policies from the Biden administration are identical to those of the Trump administration. It's simply a lie. But Abbott says, listen, I have a constitutional right to defy the federal government and to defy the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling, if not the exact letter. And we're going to continue to erect these barriers. Abbott was interviewed by the Fox Propaganda Network, and his non-answer to this very real question should also be disturbing.
Governor, will you instruct your officers to physically prevent federal officers from accessing that part of the border?
So what Texas is doing is just very simple. And that is because the Biden administration has really, truly abdicated its responsibility to secure the border and enforce the laws. Texas very simply is securing the border. And so we put up the razor wire that you were talking about, Bill, and we put up all these barricades that actually have denied illegal entry. And as you pointed out also in that screen, that there are criminals coming across our border. Texas has a right as a state to stop criminals from coming into our state, to make arrests of those criminals. And we have National Guard as well as Texas Department of Public Safety officers who are there to make those arrests and to deny illegal entry. And Joe Biden actually does have an option here. Joe Biden's option is to enforce the laws of the United States and stop this illegal entry.
So note that he didn't answer the question. That was a complete non-answer, either because he intends to fully do it or because he's cowardly posturing and doesn't want to admit that he is not prepared to go that far. But either way, the fact that a sitting governor, a Republican governor, did not say, no, of course not, because of federal supremacy, even though I disagree with the Biden administration, even though the court order didn't tell us to take down the wire, it just said we couldn't prevent the Biden administration from cutting it. Of course, we would never get into a physical altercation with the federal government. He didn't answer that way. Instead, he left the door open to it, which is absolutely despicable. Some other things I want to point out. He says it's an effective deterrent against the illegal border crossings. According to news reports, that's not necessarily the case. There are people who live near the southern border in Texas who say people will just put a blanket over the razor wire and people are still flooding in anyway. So I would need to see hard data that this profoundly cruel razor wire, which has gotten people killed, as we discussed in previous videos, towards the end of last year, that it's a deterrent, right? So Abbott, of course, doesn't cite any. He's again hyping this up. The Texas National Guard continues to hold the line in Eagle Pass. Texas will not back down from our efforts to secure the border in Biden's absence. Joaquin Castro, who is a Texas congressman, says Greg Abbott is using the Texas National Guard to obstruct and create chaos at the border. If Abbott is defying yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, the president needs to establish sole federal control of the Texas National Guard now. And it's important to remember that the National Guard operates in dual capacities. They are typically under the command and control of whatever state governor in which they reside. So the Texas National Guard is typically the day-to-day control is under the Texas governor. But the National Guard also has a federal allegiance as well. And in emergencies, or with the permission of the governor, the president of the United States can federalize the National Guard. Obviously, he's not going to get permission from Abbott, but he could employ Title X, or he could, employ the Insurrection Act if he really wanted to. And at the end of the day, there's very little that Greg Abbott could do about it. But of course, Texas also has not just domestic law enforcement within its borders. It also has the Texas State Guard, which is like a quasi-state military, which Texas and other states are allowed to have. So again, the risks here are really, really extraordinary. In a reporter, Sawyer Hackett, also talks about, again, Joaquin Castro is urging President Biden to nationalize or federalize the Texas National Guard. As reports indicate that Abbott is defying the Supreme Court, Abbott isn't above the law. This is a good fight to pick. And I'm also inclined to agree, as risky as it is. It's very, very risky because it's not just Abbott. Abbott is also getting actively encouraged by people like Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, the most powerful elected Republican in the United States, second in line to the presidency. I stand with Governor Abbott. The House will do everything in its power to back him up. The next step, holding Secretary Mayorkas accountable. Alejandro Mayorkas, of course, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the man who is responsible for the day-to-day enforcement of the southern border, and Republicans intend to impeach him. But it goes beyond Mike Johnson, too. You have other governors, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, Oklahoma Governor Stitt, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, all announced today that they stand with Texas and Greg Abbott in Texas's border dispute with the federal government. Red states banding together regarding the border crisis. So he's getting this active encouragement from multiple Republican vectors in multiple levels of government. That's going to put pressure on Abbott as well to not back down, because it's like anything else. You're in a confrontation with somebody, verbal, it may get physical, and your friends or your associates are hyping you up. Don't back down. We stand with you. We stand in solidarity. All that's going to do is increase the likelihood of escalation. Other people I'll point out here, Clay Higgins, Congressman Higgins, Republican. We mentioned this in a previous video. He says his thoughts are that the feds are staging a civil war in Texas, should stand their ground. Marjorie Taylor Greene says that the ruling was outrageous. She supports Texas. And Mehdi Hassan, a progressive commentator who used to be with MSNBC, made a fascinating point that I think should be driven home time and time again. He says, imagine if during the Trump presidency, Democratic California Governor Gavin Newsom, with the support of a Democratic House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, had openly defied the federal government and the Supreme Court. The right would have lost their minds. It would have been the biggest or perhaps only story in the news. And he is absolutely correct. The double standard, the asymmetry of expectation, it would have been the biggest story in the news. And honestly, it would and should have been the biggest news even in mainstream media like CNN and Fox News, the non-Fox News mainstream media, CNN, the New York Times, the Associated Press, Washington Post would all be talking about this and even writing op-eds condemning it. There would be very little by way of cheerleading, I think, even on MSNBC as well. But Republicans get to play by a different set of rules. I told you, the American politics for the Republican Party is playing on easy mode, the easiest difficulty level, with all the cheat codes enabled, like, unlimited ammo and everything else. Hopefully not literally in this case, but you see what I'm saying? Like, they're graded on a curve. It would never, this charitability would never and should never be granted in a similar situation under different circumstances. It should be granted here. I'll also point out a couple of things. Number one, people say, well, Josiah, blue states defy, border and immigration policy all the time with sanctuary cities. That's not quite true. So in the situation with sanctuary cities, what you have is state and local governments saying that they won't go out of their way to allocate resources to assist the federal government, right? And that may very well be enough of a disconnect between the federal government and federal law for you to object to. You might be able to say that, no, you should allocate resources to comply with federal law. Fair enough. But that is fundamentally different from saying, actually, I'm going to allocate resources to go out of my way to frustrate federal law, to openly prevent federal law, and to prevent the federal government from enforcing federal law. These are meaningful distinctions. So to whatever extent you're bothered by sanctuary cities, as the right often are, this is objectively, in the eyes of the law, much worse because it is a state government going out of its way to not just merely not comply, it is openly defying and preventing the federal government from enforcing federal law in an area of which the federal government has supremacy. So it's fundamentally different. And I'll also point out that there are risks to President Biden, how he reacts. Some people would say, listen, if he reacts harshly, if he federalizes the National Guard, that they'll say this is tyrannical Joe Biden. Then Republicans may attempt to flip the switch on the president and say that, in fact, he is the one who is a tyrant. They probably do that. They're that cynical and they're that dishonest. And I do think that that's a real risk. But I think the greater risk ultimately, and also on the merits, is Biden not doing anything about this and tolerating this. This is intolerable. The federal supremacy over the southern border is real. It is constitutional, and it's even reinforced by a right-wing Supreme Court. It would set a dangerous, not just like a disturbing, but a genuinely, perhaps even existentially dangerous threat to the stability of the United States to allow this precedent to go unanswered. President Biden should respond. He should respond decisively. He should respond forcefully and force Greg Abbott to back down. That's what I believe. I don't know what will happen. It's entirely possible that Biden might get nervous and might get scared and perhaps he might even work this diplomatically behind the scenes. I'm not even saying that there's not merit to that. But Biden should publicly respond to this, regardless of what he's doing in the back room. This is a public demonstration of defiance, and it needs a public response one way or another. And the last thing I'll say is, well, why are you so disturbed? It's not like you're worried about a civil war. Yeah, I am actually. I'm not saying that it's probable. I'm not saying that it's likely. But the fact that it's a greater than 0% chance, the fact that it's possible enough that I'm genuinely asking the question means it's too possible, right? It's almost like if you have a roommate or a coworker, if you are bound by some sort of contract with a person in a shared space, a roommate, a spouse, a business partner, whatever. I suppose it's literally possible that they may attack you, right? I suppose anything is possible. But presumably, you're not really worried about it. You're not thinking, there's a 10% chance, a 20% chance, a 30% chance, a 70% chance. But if it ever got to the point where you looked at your roommate and it's tense enough that you're having a confrontation and you think, wow, it's very possible that this person might hit me, or this person might attack me, or this person might try to harm me, that it might come to a physical confrontation, you would have serious concerns about living with that person, right? And that's kind of where I am. I'm not saying it's probable that we'll have a civil war, but the fact that it's a greater than 0% chance is genuinely disturbing. And that is another reason why Democrats and any sane Republican left in the United States, but certainly President Biden, has to respond to this strategically, thoughtfully, but decisively and publicly. Let me know what you think in the comments.